very good morning to you from Sweden. My name is Magnus Holberg, and I will go through a little bit about water, which is one of the best and funniest and most interesting things I like to work with. I will talk about water, as I said, and I will do it in 3 parts, short parts in themselves. The first part is history about the water, how it started, or the big civilizations, how they handle the water. Secondly, the second video, part 2, will be a short information overview over groundwater and surface water. Part 3 will be, I call it a quickie quiz question. It's not so tricky quiz question, sorry about that, it's a little hard to pronounce, but it's some questions about part 1 and part 2. If you're interested, we'll go through them. But basically 3 parts, 3 videos. So let's start. The Greeks. Now, the Greek society is famous for how it developed and how the cities grown. Now, I'm going to talk about some references actually from Crete, but it goes of course to all of Greece and the big cities in Greece like Athens. And we talk about the era between 3,500 up to 1200 before Christ. So we're talking about 2,000 to 5,000 years ago. So it's way back for us today. Now, in those times, you had groundwater as your source for drinking water. And when you talk about water, you need to also remember that it's not only for drinking we use the drinking water, or potable water as some might say, but you have drinking and cooking, but you also have wash water to wash yourself and so forth and so on. And that was of course the same in ancient times as it is today, with some differences that we'll talk about a little bit later on. Also, you have other uses of water. In the Greek days, you have fountains, you have public baths. Not so uncommon to be seen today either. So in general, even looking back several thousand years ago, you can see the same patterns and how the water was used. Now, one thing I would like to add is that in Greece, they decided on a way to select the person that will be in charge of the water. And I raise this issue or question because it points out already in those days, or when it all started, the importance of water. Now, the person in charge for the water distribution or water system in Greece was a guy called responsible for the fountains. Now, that was one of the highest offices that you could be appointed to. Or not appointed to, but elected to. And they wanted to elect a person in order to ensure that there was as little bias as possible when you decided on who should be responsible for this key thing for the society's growth and wealth. So, having said that, let's move on to another part of the water distribution systems. Now, this is about cities getting water. And in order to transport the water from the springs, or wells if you want to say that, far up in the mountain, you needed to build some sort of system that could guide the water down to the cities. And this was done by excavating in mountains, as you can see here. And it wasn't 5 or 6 meters, it was several hundred meters, even kilometers, that was dug through mountains. And also channels were built. So it was an elaborate piece of engineering that went into the system several thousand years ago. And the pictures you see here is from, as I mentioned before, Crete. But also, this was like the main aorta of water going down. And when you came to the cities, you needed a piping system, which in the ancient times also were built by using clay or terracotta, as it's called. So the groundwater, the transportation system, the distribution system in the cities were quite complicated, but they were functional, so the cities could grow. Now, what about the next example I would like to present to you? What do you think it will be? It could be, of course, the Romans. Now, the Romans learned from the Greek, but they also had a water distribution system. And when we talk time-wise, we talk about 700 before Christ till about 500 after Christ. And just as the Greeks, they used groundwater as their source of supply for the water. And they also had elaborate systems for transport and distribution. Now, in Greece, I pointed out the election process of the person responsible for the water system. In Rome, they also knew and recognized the importance of the water system. And they actually saw the water as a deity. And also, water was a sign of great power. So if you had the big fountain or a water distribution system in the house, it was a sign of a very wealthy and rich and powerful family. Now, we're also going to use the Romans for another thing. That is looking at how much water were consumed. And even today, this is a very, 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 very important question, because water is scarce. It's not in abundance. So how did it look in the ancient times? How much water usage did we have? Now, I'll take the Romans as an example again, and we'll pick a time around 100 after Christ. The water going down to the Rome area in those days was about 12 cubic meters per second. Now, is this a lot or a little? Well, my thing or question or idea for you would be, if you're interested, to check with your local water company or municipal water company and ask them the question, how much water do you produce every day and is delivered to us here in the city or the town or the region? Ask that and bear in mind these 12 cubic meters per second that was coming to the Rome area in the ancient times in Rome. Now, there is of course the question of how much water did each person use, or should I say, how much was the water consumption divided on everybody that was in Rome? In those days, it was about 1,500 liters per day and person. Again, the question to you, is it much, is it little? Well, the picture that just came up here behind me shows big baths or big pools of water where they have like sea battles. So this would indicate that 1,500 liters per day in person is not a small volume of water each day. So let's move on to the Rome in modern days, in the 1990s. How much water is now produced for the Rome area? It's about 23 cubic meters per second that's going down to Rome. Question is, how much water for every person? It's about a third. It's 500 liters per day per person compared to 100 after Christ. So this gives you a notion of a trend that's even is today, and even more important today, is that the water consumption per person needs to go down because water is not in abundance. And from the Roman time, 100 AD, to the modern times in Rome, it's about 1/3. And probably the 1919 figure might be even lower today, but you can check that. You can Google on that, of course. So the water consumption is going down from ancient times until today, and even today you will see decrease because we need to take care of our water supplies. Now, short summary of what I just talked about. First of all, the source of raw water. Well, the groundwater is, in the ancient times, the drinking water source, and wash water, and for public bath, and for fountains. And the reason for that we'll talk about in part 2 when I talk about groundwater and surface water. But groundwater was the main source, and even today many people in Sweden, in Europe, in India, in the States, in Canada, wherever you want to be, South America, you will find groundwater is a very common source of your drinking water. Next part, transport of water. And as you saw from the Greek, from the Romans, they had elaborate and quite skilled engineers that made these transportation systems, as well as the distribution systems in the towns. Now, how would that compare to modern times? Well, it's not something I will go into here, but in Europe and the rest of the world, for most parts, the development of water distribution system came in the 18th and 19th century. So we were rather late with this elaborate water distribution systems in general here. But that we'll take in another video. Now, distribution system, distribution networks. I said we had for the consumers, the people living in the city, they needed water. But also, and this I bring up because having drinking water will raise a need for treating the used drinking water, the sewage water handling. And that is the water, when it's used by us consumers, people, it needs to go to waste. And the wastewater, which is not something I will talk about here today, but that's a question that will follow drinking water wherever you go. So if you supply drinking water to a town or a place, then you need to, at the moment you say we're going to supply drinking water to this area, you need to start thinking of how do we solve the sewage treatment. But that's not for the video today. That will come a little bit later. So, finally, a question to you. Do we value water today as the Greek did, as the Romans did in the ancient times? Is it a deity? Do we see it as critical? Do we value it as the Greeks and the Romans? The question is impossible to answer, but every time you drink, or you cook, or you wash, or you take a swim in the pool, you should always think about the water, how important it is to you. And then the question will answer itself, I hope. But anyway, I leave that for you. And finally, since I don't like paying royalties, I will sing you a little bit of a song from Sweden to close this part 1, short summary history of the water. Vi mötte ett skepp i den svalkande monsun, där vi ångade mot Röda havet upp. En förriggare dess var, och dess namn det var Typhoon, som nu seglar från Västindien till Good Hope. Thank you very much, and may your water be with you. Take good care. See you later. Bye-bye.